What happens when you possess perfect knowledge but imperfect understanding? I believed I could see further than any being in the galaxy. I believed that warning my father of betrayal would be enough to stop it. I was the master of the Thousand Suns, Primarch of the 60 Legion, and I commanded powers that made reality itself bend to my will. But in trying to save the Emperor, I shattered the only thing that might have actually protected humanity. My name is Magnus the Red. This is what happened when I tried to do the right thing. The galaxy teaches brutal lessons to those who believe themselves above its laws. I learned mine in the span of hours, a single ritual, one desperate attempt to deliver a warning, and everything I had built across centuries collapsed, not slowly, not with the dignity of a structure weakening over time, but instantly, catastrophically, like a crystal struck at precisely the right frequency to shatter it into dust. I stand now in a place that should not exist, ruling a legion that is barely recognizable as what it once was. And I ask myself the same question every day. Would I have made different choices if I had known the cost? The answer should be simple. But I have learned that nothing involving foresight and consequence is ever truly simple. I was born into certainty. Not the crude certainty of those who mistake ignorance for wisdom, but the earned certainty that comes from understanding the fundamental architecture of reality itself. While my brothers learned to swing swords and command armies, I learned to unmake and remake the substance of existence. The Emperor created me for a purpose, though I would not understand that purpose until far too late. My first clear memory is of light. Not the light of a sun or torch, but the light of pure understanding flooding into a consciousness that had just become aware of itself. I opened my eye, singular even then, and I saw everything. Not just the physical laboratory, where I had been gestated, but the layers of reality beneath and beyond. The warp currents flowing through the materium like veins carrying blood. The psychic residue left by every thought and emotion of every being within range. The fundamental equations that governed how matter and energy interacted. The Emperor stood before me. Even then, newly born, I recognized him as something beyond comprehension. Where I saw layers of reality, he was reality. A being so vast and ancient that looking at him psychically was like trying to comprehend an ocean while being a single drop of water. He smiled, and I felt something I would later identify as pride. "You see clearly, my son," he said. His voice resonated across multiple dimensions simultaneously. "That clarity will be your greatest gift and your greatest danger." I did not understand the warning then. How could I? I had been conscious for mere moments. I knew only that I possessed abilities that made me unique, even among the Primarchs. I could reshape matter with thought, navigate the warp with precision others could only dream of. I saw connections and patterns that others missed entirely. How could such gifts be dangerous? Prospero was my sanctuary. A world where knowledge was not feared but celebrated, where the pursuit of understanding was considered the highest calling. When I claimed it as the homeworld for my legion, I transformed it into a monument to learning. The pyramid of Photep rose from the ground according to plans I had drafted in a single night of fevered inspiration. Its proportions were mathematically perfect, creating resonance fields that amplified psychic ability and promoted clarity of thought. Every angle, every measurement, every inscription served a purpose in the grand design. My sons, the Thousand Suns, were scholars first and warriors second. We did not simply fight. We comprehended what we fought, why we fought, and what our fighting meant in the grand calculus of the galaxy. Every battle was a theorem to be proven. Every enemy, a text to be decoded. When we encountered a new Xenos species, we studied their biology, their culture, their technology before we destroyed them. Knowledge should never be wasted, even when that knowledge came from beings that had to be eliminated for humanity's survival. The libraries of Tizca grew year by year. We collected texts from every world we brought into compliance. Histories, philosophies, scientific treatises, religious documents. Everything was preserved, catalogued, analyzed. Some of my brothers mocked this habit. Perturabo called it hoarding. Mortarion called it dangerous dabbling in forbidden lore. But I knew the value of information. The Imperium was expanding across a galaxy full of threats. The more we understood about that galaxy, the better equipped we would be to ensure humanity's survival. The other legions looked at us with suspicion. Leman Russ and his space wolves particularly. They saw our studies of the warp as corruption waiting to happen. They could not distinguish between understanding a force and being consumed by it. The difference, I believe then, was discipline. Control. The application of rigorous methodology to phenomena that the ignorant dismissed as unknowable chaos. I remember standing in the pyramid of Photep, my greatest library, watching the last rays of Prospero's sun filter through crystalline walls that I had grown from the bedrock itself using transmutation techniques that took me 40 years to perfect. My chief librarian, Arzek Ahriman, stood beside me as we reviewed the latest findings from our expeditions into the Great Ocean. That was what we called the warp then. Not a realm of demons and madness, but an ocean of pure thought and energy waiting to be charted and understood. The temperature of the reading chamber was maintained at exactly 18 degrees. The shelves contained 47,000 texts, each positioned according to subject resonance patterns that optimized psychic accessibility. The lighting came not from flames or lumen strips, but from crystalline matrices that converted psychic energy into visible light, creating an illumination that responded to the mental state of anyone in the room. When scholars were focused and calm, the light was steady and bright. When they were frustrated or confused, it dimmed, encouraging them to rest before continuing their studies. I had designed every aspect of this space to facilitate the acquisition and preservation of knowledge. It was perfect. It was controlled. It was everything I believed the Imperium should aspire to become. A civilization that valued understanding over ignorance, that sought to illuminate rather than simply destroy, that recognized knowledge itself as humanity's greatest weapon against a hostile galaxy. Ahriman turned from the data slate he was studying. His psychic presence was always distinctive among my sons, disciplined and precise like a blade that had been honed to perfect sharpness. My lord, the latest scans from the Western Immaterium sectors show concerning fluctuations. The patterns are not random. Something vast is moving through the warp currents. I examined the readings myself. He was correct. The disturbances showed intentionality, purpose. Something or someone was orchestrating events in the Immaterium on a scale that dwarfed even my considerable understanding. The patterns resembled tides, but tides with intelligence behind them, as if an ocean had developed consciousness and will. I should have recognized the signature then, should have understood what it meant when currents that old and that powerful began to shift. I had studied the warp extensively, had mapped regions that no other psyker dared explore. I knew the major warp entities by their psychic signatures, the way a sailor might know the sea by its moods and movements. But these patterns were unfamiliar. Or rather, they were so old that I had no reference point for them, like finding fossils of creatures that had lived before recorded time. Continue monitoring, I directed. Correlate with any changes in precognitive accuracy among our Corvidae. If something is disrupting the future, we need to know why. The Corvidae were our seers, specialists in temporal scrying who could glimpse probable futures and guide our strategic planning accordingly. If the warp disturbances were affecting the timeline itself, they would notice the changes in their predictions. Patterns that should have resolved cleanly would become murky. Probabilities that should have been clear would become ambiguous. This was how we operated, methodical, systematic. We did not fear the unknown. We illuminated it through careful study. When other legions encountered warp phenomena, they called for exterminatus and moved on. We stayed. We documented. We learned. Every piece of information was potentially valuable. Every mystery was simply a puzzle waiting to be solved through sufficient application of intelligence and will. The Emperor had tasked all his sons with bringing the galaxy into compliance. But my role, I understood, was different. While Horus conquered and Guilliman administered, I was to understand, to pierce the veil of ignorance that kept humanity stumbling in the dark. The imperial truth taught that there were no gods, no spirits, only misunderstood natural phenomena. I was to be the one who understood them, who could explain in scientific terms what the superstitious called supernatural, who could take the mysterious and make it known. My brothers did not appreciate this distinction. Mortarion, with his crude materialism, actively despised what he called my dabbling. He had been raised on a world ruled by warp-wielding overlords and saw any use of psychic power as inherently corrupting. No amount of explanation could make him understand that knowledge itself was neutral, that understanding a force was not the same as being controlled by it. Korax thought me arrogant, and perhaps he was right about that. I did believe I was special, that my abilities made me uniquely suited to exploring regions that would destroy lesser minds. But I saw that as fact, not arrogance. A blade is not arrogant for being sharp. A telescope is not arrogant for seeing distant stars. I was simply acknowledging what I was capable of. Even Horus, who I counted as a friend, would sometimes warn me to be cautious in my studies. We would speak during the rare times when our campaigns brought us to the same region of space, and inevitably he would ask about my research. He never criticized directly. That was not his way. But he would suggest that I consider how my studies appeared to others. That perception mattered almost as much as reality when it came to maintaining unity within the Imperium. I appreciated his concern, but could not fully accept his premise. Truth was truth, regardless of how it appeared to observers. If others feared my studies because they did not understand them, the solution was education, not abandonment of valuable research. The Imperium needed psychers who understood their abilities, who could use them safely and effectively. My work was providing the foundation for that understanding. I stood 7 meters tall when I chose to, though I could adjust my physical form with thought alone. My skin was red, a deliberate choice to distinguish myself and my legion from the baseline human population we were created to protect. Some called it unsettling. I called it honest. We were not human, not anymore. We were post-human, something built to be humanity's guardians and weapons. Pretending otherwise was dishonest. My single eye could perceive spectrums of reality that most beings could not conceive existed. I saw the material world, yes, but also the warp currents flowing beneath it, the psychic residue of emotions and thoughts, the probability streams that constituted potential futures. I existed simultaneously in multiple layers of reality. My consciousness stretched across dimensions in ways that would shatter a normal mind instantly, and I was loyal. This must be understood. Everything that followed came from loyalty, from a desperate need to protect my father and his Imperium from threats I alone could perceive. I loved the Emperor, not as a subject loves a ruler, but as a son loves a father. He had created me, given me purpose, trusted me with knowledge that others could not bear. I would have done anything to protect him. That was the problem. I would have done anything, and eventually I did. The first true warning came during a routine psychic reconnaissance. I had sent my consciousness into the warp to survey the region near the Istvan system. The Great Crusade was progressing well in that sector. Horus commanded the operation personally, and his record was flawless as always. 63 worlds brought into compliance over the past 18 months. Resistance minimal, infrastructure largely intact for transfer to imperial governance. There was no reason for concern, but something felt wrong. The texture of the immaterium around Istvan was different, corrupted, like fabric that had been worn too thin in places, allowing something beneath to show through. I extended my perception carefully, using the techniques I had refined over decades. I was not pushing into the warp recklessly. I was observing, reading, interpreting signs that any other being would have missed entirely. The warp around Istvan should have been relatively calm. The system had been brought into compliance peacefully. The population had accepted imperial rule without significant resistance. There should have been minimal negative emotion feeding into the immaterium. Instead, I sensed roiling chaos, fury, ambition, despair, pleasure, the four fundamental corruptions swirling together in patterns that spoke of deliberate manipulation. I pulled my perception deeper, following the currents back to their source, and I saw Horus. Not his physical form, which remained on the surface of Istvan, coordinating the campaign, but his psychic signature, usually bright and clear as a star. Now it flickered, wavered, and around it I saw other presences, 4 of them, ancient, powerful, patient. They were doing something to him, weaving threads of corruption so subtle that Horus himself would not feel them, slowly turning the War Master, the Emperor's most trusted son, into something else. I watched as they worked, their efforts coordinated with a precision that suggested this had been planned for years, perhaps decades. Perhaps since before Horus had been found on Chthoniya. One thread connected to his pride. Whispers that the Emperor had grown distant, that the War Master carried the real burden of the crusade while the Emperor played with secret projects on Terra, that Horus deserved recognition for his efforts, that he was the true leader of humanity's expansion, not merely a servant of an increasingly absent father. Another thread connected to his ambition, visions of what the Imperium could become under his leadership, suggestions that the Emperor's vision was limited, that humanity could be so much more than what the imperial truth allowed, that Horus could guide humanity to a glorious future if he was willing to make difficult choices. A third thread connected to his love for his brothers, images of Primarchs who had been censured or punished for minor infractions, reminders of the 2 legions that had been expunged from all records for unknown reasons, implications that the Emperor would discard any of his sons if they proved disappointing, that Horus needed to protect his brothers from their father's potential judgment. The fourth thread was the most insidious. It connected to Horus's certainty that he was doing the right thing, that he was loyal, that everything he did was in service to humanity's future. This thread did not corrupt his intentions. It corrupted his understanding of what loyalty meant, made him believe that opposing the Emperor might be the most loyal thing he could do. I watched in horror as these threads wove tighter. The entities behind them were patient. They were not forcing anything. They were simply guiding, nudging, allowing Horus to believe that every thought and decision was his own, while ensuring that those thoughts and decisions led exactly where they wanted. I withdrew immediately. This was beyond study, beyond academic interest. This was catastrophe unfolding in real time. Horus was being corrupted, not by simple traitors or Zeno's influence, but by entities within the warp itself. Beings I had studied but never truly understood the scope of. The ones the ancient texts called the ruinous powers. My first instinct was to gather more data, to confirm what I had seen before acting. I needed to verify through independent observation, needed to ensure I was not misinterpreting normal warp fluctuations as active corruption. The entities I had glimpsed were subtle. It was possible I was seeing patterns where none existed. Possible my awareness of their existence was causing me to find evidence of their influence even where it did not exist. But even as I formulated the plan for verification, I felt the urgency pressing down on me. If Horus fell, if the War Master turned against the Emperor, the damage would be incalculable. Half the legions followed his direct command. The entire crusade could collapse. Worlds that had been brought into compliance might rebel. Zeno's threats that had been contained might resurge. The Imperium itself could fracture. How much time did I have? The corruption I had witnessed was advanced, not beginning. Not in early stages, the threads were already woven deep into Horus's psyche. If I waited to verify, to gather more evidence, to proceed with proper academic rigor, it might be too late. The corruption might become irreversible. I called Ahriman to my chambers. The architecture of my personal sanctum had been designed to amplify psychic clarity. Geometric patterns in the floor and ceiling created resonance fields that made contemplation easier, decision-making clearer. The walls were inscribed with focusing runes that helped organize thoughts. Even the temperature and air pressure were optimized for cognitive function. I needed that clarity now more than ever. He entered with the practiced efficiency that characterized all his movements. Ahriman never wasted motion or time. When he walked, it was along the most efficient path. When he spoke, it was with precisely the words needed to convey his meaning. He had been one of my first recruits to the Legion, a psyker from a Terran enclave who had shown remarkable discipline even before his transformation into a space marine. "I have seen something in the warp," I told him without preamble. "Horus is being corrupted by entities we have only studied in theory. The process is advanced. If we do not act, the War Master will turn against the Emperor." Ahriman's expression shifted through calculation. He was analyzing the claim, weighing it against known data, considering implications and possibilities. This was what I valued about him. He did not simply accept or reject information. He processed it. "Have you confirmed this through multiple observations? Independent verification protocols?" I had not. I had seen what I had seen, and I knew my abilities were unmatched. No other psyker in the Imperium could perceive what I could perceive. My observations did not require verification the way a normal researcher's might. But his question was valid. It was the question I should have asked myself. Instead, I felt the weight of urgency pressing down. Every moment I spent confirming was a moment the corruption deepened. "There is no time," I replied. "I must warn the Emperor immediately." Ahriman was silent for several seconds. His psychic presence radiated concern, though his physical expression remained neutral. "My lord, forgive me, but have you considered the mechanism of warning? Astropathic communication is too slow and too vulnerable to interception. Physical travel would take months. By the time you reach Terra, whatever is happening to Horus could be complete." He was correct. I had already performed these calculations myself. There was only one way to reach my father with the speed this crisis demanded. A way he had explicitly forbidden, a way that violated the most fundamental restriction he had placed on all his sons. I would have to use sorcery to bridge the distance between Prospero and Terra. I would have to break through the psychic barriers protecting the Imperial Palace and deliver my warning directly into his mind. Would have to violate the Nicaea Edict. The Council of Nicaea had been held 3 years earlier. The Emperor had summoned all his sons to judge whether the use of psychic powers, what the ignorant called sorcery, should be permitted within the legions. The entire affair had been orchestrated by those who feared what they did not understand. Mortarion had argued passionately for complete prohibition, his voice dripping with hatred for anything touched by the warp. Russ had been only slightly more measured, but his conclusion was the same. Psychic powers were dangerous. They led to corruption. They should be banned entirely. I had defended the necessity of understanding and using these powers responsibly. I had presented evidence from decades of research, had shown how controlled psychic ability could be an asset to the Imperium, had demonstrated the safeguards my Legion employed to prevent corruption. I had been eloquent, logical, thorough. The Emperor had ruled against me. Psychers would be restricted. Librarius departments disbanded. The use of certain techniques, particularly those involving warp entities, was forbidden absolutely. He had looked at me when he delivered the judgment, and I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, but concern, as if he feared what I might become if I continued my studies. I had complied. Publicly, the Librarius of the Thousand Suns was officially disbanded. Rituals and techniques deemed too dangerous were locked away in secure archives. We presented ourselves as obedient sons following our father's decree. But I had also continued my studies in secret. I told myself this was necessary, that the restriction was temporary, that once my father saw the value of controlled psychic research, the prohibition would be lifted. I had not stopped learning. I had simply learned more quietly, had hidden my most advanced research from even my own sons, had developed techniques that pushed far beyond what the Nikaya edict permitted. Now that forbidden knowledge offered the only path to save everything we had built. The choice seemed obvious. Break one rule to prevent catastrophe. My father would understand once I explained. Once I showed him what I had discovered and how I had used that knowledge to save him from betrayal. He would see that the ends justified the means, that sometimes rules needed to be broken for the greater good. I will breach the Imperial Palace wards, I told Ahriman. I will deliver the warning directly to the Emperor. He must know about Horus before the corruption is complete. Ahriman's psychic presence radiated deepening concern. My lord, the palace defenses are not simply walls. They are the Emperor's own work. Breaking through them could cause damage we cannot predict, and the use of sorcery on that scale, in direct violation of Nikaya, it will have consequences. I know, I replied, but the alternative is worse. If Horus falls, and I did nothing, if I had the power to prevent it and chose caution instead, I would bear responsibility for every death that followed, every world that burns, every human life lost in civil war. That weight would be unbearable. He could not argue with that logic. Neither could I. The mathematics were clear. One violation of protocol versus the potential collapse of the entire Imperium. Millions of lives versus potentially billions. The temporary anger of my father versus the permanent fracturing of everything he had built. How could I not act? How could I know what was coming and simply stand aside? That would be the real betrayal. Not breaking a rule, but refusing to use my abilities when they were needed most. The Emperor had created me to see what others could not, to perceive threats that would remain invisible to lesser beings. What was the point of those abilities if I did not use them when it mattered? Will you require assistance with the ritual? Ahriman asked. His tone indicated he already knew the answer but needed to hear it confirmed. Yes, I replied. I will need anchors. The working will be more intensive than anything I have attempted before. Without stabilization, my consciousness could be lost in the transit. I will need 9 of our strongest sorcerers to maintain the connection between my body and mind. Ahriman nodded. I will select them personally. When do you wish to begin? Immediately. Every moment we delay is a moment the corruption of Horus deepens. We act now. I chose the highest chamber of the pyramid of Photep for the working. The geometry of the space created natural amplification of psychic energy. The walls were inscribed with focusing runes I had developed myself after years of research into the fundamental language of the Immaterium. The floor was inlaid with silver in patterns that channeled psychic force along specific vectors. Even the air pressure and temperature were precisely controlled to optimize psychic resonance. Everything was designed to channel power with maximum efficiency and minimum waste. I had built this chamber over the course of 3 years, personally overseeing every detail. Each rune had been inscribed according to specifications I had calculated through months of theoretical work. The silver inlays had been poured while I maintained active psychic monitoring to ensure the metallic bonds formed in alignment with warp currents. This was not simply architecture. It was a psychic instrument, and I was about to play it at volumes it had never been designed to withstand. 9 of my most powerful sorcerers joined me. Ahriman had selected them according to my specifications. Each was a master of a different psychic discipline. One specialized in temporal manipulation, able to slow or accelerate his personal time stream. Another in spatial awareness, capable of perceiving distant locations as if standing in them. A third in telekinesis of such precision he could manipulate individual molecules, and so on. Each brought unique capabilities that would contribute to stabilizing the working. Not because I needed their strength, though I would draw on it, but because the ritual required stabilization. I would be extending my consciousness across an impossible distance while simultaneously gathering enough force to pierce the Emperor's own defenses. Without anchors in physical reality, I risked dissolution. My body would remain here while my mind traveled, and these 9 would ensure I had something to return to. They took their positions around the chamber according to the pattern I had specified. Each stood at a point where the geometric lines of force converged. Each placed their hands on focusing crystals that rose from the floor. Each began the preliminary meditations that would align their psychic rhythms with mine. I stood at the center, the focal point of the entire structure, the place where all the lines of force met and amplified each other. I could feel the chamber responding to our presence, the runes beginning to glow with energy that had no physical source. The air becoming thick with potential, the chamber filled with energy as we began the initial invocations. These were not prayers. We were not calling on any entity or power for assistance. We were simply aligning ourselves with fundamental principles of the warp, stating our intention in language that the immaterium could understand, making our will known to reality itself. I could feel the warp responding to our call. It was always there, just beyond the thin membrane of reality, waiting to be accessed by those with the knowledge and will to do so. Some called it dangerous. I called it a tool. Like any tool, it required skill to use properly. A sword in the hands of a trained warrior was a weapon of precision. In the hands of an untrained child, it was a danger to everyone around it. The difference was not the tool, but the user. I reached out, pulling energy from the great ocean. Not summoning anything, not invoking any entity or making any bargain. Simply accessing the raw power that existed in that realm and channeling it through my own will. This was not corruption. This was mastery. The difference between swimming in an ocean and drowning in it. I knew the currents, understood the tides, could navigate waters that would pull lesser psychers under. The amount of power required to breach the palace wards was staggering. I pulled harder, drawing more deeply than I ever had before. The chamber filled with light that was not light, energy that existed in spectrums human senses could not process. My 9 anchors strained to maintain stability. I felt one of them falter, his mind beginning to crack under the pressure of channeling so much force. I reinforced him with a fragment of my own strength, extending a portion of my consciousness to shore up his failing discipline. It was like trying to hold a dam together with your hands, while the water pressure built beyond tolerance. But I had to maintain all 9 anchors. Losing even one would unbalance the entire working. The forces we were manipulating were too vast to control with imprecise methods. I continued gathering power. The chamber was not designed for this volume of energy. I could feel the runes beginning to overheat, the silver inlays in the floor starting to vibrate as they struggled to channel more force than their physical structure could accommodate. But I could not stop now, had not yet accumulated enough power to breach defenses that the Emperor himself had constructed. I could feel Prospero beneath me. The entire planet resonated with psychic energy. My sons, all my 1,000 sons across the world, were unconsciously contributing to the working. Their combined mental discipline created a foundation I could build upon. 40,000 space marines, all trained in psychic techniques, all focused on their studies at this moment, all unknowingly feeding power into the ritual. Every meditation session being conducted in the libraries. Every psychic exercise being practiced in the training halls. Every attempt at precognition or telepathy or telekinesis happening anywhere on the planet. All of it was flowing through the connections I had established between my sons. Connections they were barely aware existed. I had woven a subtle web of psychic bonds throughout the entire Legion, allowing me to draw on their collective strength when necessary. They would feel fatigue afterward, exhaustion without clear cause, but they would not know why. would not understand that they had been used as batteries to power a ritual that violated every principle the Nikaya edict had established. This too was a betrayal, though I did not recognize it as such at the time. I was using my sons without their knowledge or consent, but I told myself it was necessary, that the ends justified the means, that they would understand once I had saved the Imperium. It still was not enough. The distance to Terra was vast, tens of thousands of light years. The palace wards were multi-layered, each one a masterwork of psychic engineering that would require tremendous force to penetrate. I had studied those wards from afar, had analyzed their structure during my visits to Terra, knew that they were built in 9 concentric shells, each one designed to stop a different category of psychic intrusion. The outermost shell deflected passive scrying, the second prevented active telepathy, the third blocked teleportation, and so on, each layer more sophisticated than the last, until the innermost shell which prevented anything from the warp from manifesting within the palace itself. To breach all 9 layers simultaneously would require power on a scale that no single psyker should be able to generate. I needed more power. I needed to draw deeper. I reached further into the great ocean, past the shallow currents I normally navigated, down into regions I had studied but never directly accessed. The power there was immense, intoxicating. I could feel it responding to my call, rushing toward me like water toward a drain. It felt eager, as if it had been waiting for me to reach this deep, as if it had known I would eventually need more than the safe, shallow currents could provide. I should have recognized the trap, should have understood that power does not wait eagerly to be used, that the deepest regions of the warp were deep for a reason, but I was desperate. Time was running out. Horus was being corrupted. My father needed to be warned. I told myself that I could handle it, that my discipline was sufficient, that my understanding of the warp made me immune to its dangers. Only later would I understand that it was not responding to my call. It was waiting, watching, and in my desperation to gather enough strength to save my father, I had opened myself to something I could not control. The power came, all at once. More than I had intended to draw, it flooded through me, through my 9 anchors, through the focusing runes inscribed throughout the chamber. The pyramid of Photep was not designed to channel this much energy. Nothing was. The runes began to crack. The silver inlays in the floor melted, liquefied silver flowing along geometric patterns that now glowed white-hot. But I held it through sheer force of will, shaped it, directed it toward my purpose. I was Magnus the Red. I had spent over a century mastering the warp. I would not be overwhelmed by it now, not when everything depended on my success. I launched my warning toward Terra, my consciousness riding a spear of psychic force powerful enough to pierce any defense. I felt the layers of wards around the Imperial Palace, detected them, mapped them. Each one was a marvel of construction, layers of psychic energy woven together with a sophistication that only the Emperor himself could have achieved. And then I drove through them like they were paper. The first 3 shells shattered instantly. The outer wards designed to deflect passive observation simply ceased to exist as my consciousness blasted through them. The 4th and 5th shells held for microseconds before failing. The 6th shell, designed to prevent possession and mental domination, actually slowed me briefly before rupturing. By the time I reached the 7th shell, I understood that I was causing catastrophic damage. These were not simple barriers meant to be penetrated and then resealed. They were load-bearing structures in a complex psychic architecture. Breaking one affected the others. I was not picking a lock. I was smashing down a door that was holding up an entire building. But I could not stop now. The momentum was too great. The power I had gathered was still flowing through me, and it would go somewhere whether I willed it or not. I crashed through the 7th and 8th shells. And then I stood before the 9th and innermost barrier. This one was different. Not simply a wall, but a seal. It separated the physical palace from the warp completely. And I understood suddenly what it was protecting. Not just the Emperor and his household, but something beneath the palace. something vast and crucial that existed partially in the warp and partially in real space. I was in. I had breached defenses my father himself had constructed. I had done the impossible. Now I simply needed to deliver my warning, and everything would be justified. All the risk, all the violation of law, all the damage I had done to the palace wards. It would be forgiven once my father understood what I had saved him from. "Father," I called out, my mental voice resonating through the psychic architecture of the palace. "Horus is compromised. The War Master has been corrupted by forces in the warp. You must act immediately to prevent catastrophe. The entities I glimpsed are moving against us. They have been planning this for years. Horus will turn. He will bring other legions with him. You must stop this before it begins." I felt him then, the vast presence that was the Emperor of mankind. His attention turned toward me, and I experienced something I had never felt before in his presence. Not disappointment, not concern. Rage. Pure, cold rage that would have incinerated a normal human mind through proximity alone. Magnus. His voice filled my mind, pressing down with weight that felt physical despite being purely psychic. "What have you done?" It was not a question. It was an accusation, and in that moment I realized something was wrong. The power I had gathered was not dissipating as it should have after delivering my message. It was still flowing through me, still building, and the breach I had made in the palace wards was not closing. It was widening. I tried to cut off the flow, tried to seal the channel I had opened between myself and the deep warp. But the power had momentum now. It was using me as a conduit, and I could not stop it. The energy was pouring through the breach I had created, flooding into the Imperial Palace itself like water through a broken dam. I saw what I had done. Beneath the palace, in the deepest chambers, where even I had never been permitted, was a mechanism, a vast psychic machine that my father had been building for decades. I did not understand its full purpose, but I understood enough. It was meant to create a pathway, a tunnel through the warp that would allow human ships to travel without relying on warp entities for navigation. The webway, an ancient Aeldari technology that my father had discovered and was attempting to replicate. A network of stable passages through the immaterium that would free humanity from dependence on the Astronomicon and the hazards of warp travel. A way to move armies and supplies instantaneously across the galaxy without risk of warp, storms, or demon incursion. The Emperor's great project. The reason he had abandoned the Great Crusade to return to Terra. The secret work that would revolutionize human civilization and make the Imperium truly invincible. And I had just destroyed it. The psychic energy I had channeled smashed through the carefully constructed barriers that separated the webway portal from the warp itself. These barriers were not defensive wards like those I had already breached. They were seals. The only thing preventing the raw warp from flooding into the webway passages and corrupting them beyond recovery. And I had shattered them completely. Demons poured through. Not summoned by me, not called or bargained with. Simply flooding through the breach because a door had been opened and they had been waiting on the other side. Entities of pure warp energy that existed only to corrupt and destroy. Things that should never be allowed to manifest in real space were now pouring into the Emperor's Webway project in numbers that defied counting. I felt my father's presence leave my mind as he moved to contain the disaster. His attention, which had been focused on me with crushing intensity, suddenly shifted. I caught fragments of what he was doing, sealing barriers, fighting to close the breach I had created, holding back the demon tide with personal force while bellowing orders to the custodians and what sounded like the Sisters of Silence. And I felt the magnitude of my error. This was not a simple violation of protocol. This was catastrophic damage to the most important project in human history. The Webway would have changed everything, would have made the Imperium secure in ways that no amount of conquest could achieve. Would have protected humanity from the warp's influence by providing safe passage through it. And I had destroyed it. Not damaged, not delayed, destroyed. The seals I had broken could not be rebuilt. The demons flooding into the webway could not be fully purged. My father would have to dedicate enormous resources just to contain the breach. Resources that should have been used to complete the project. Time that should have been spent perfecting humanity's future would now be spent cleaning up my catastrophe. The power finally stopped flowing through me. The channel closed as the entities that had provided that power decided they had accomplished what they wanted. I stood in my chamber on Prospero, my 9 anchors unconscious or dead around me, and I knew with absolute certainty that I had destroyed everything I had tried to save. 3 of the anchors were clearly dead. I could see their bodies, empty shells where minds had been burned out by energies they could not withstand. Another 3 were comatose, their minds retreating so deep into themselves that I could barely detect their consciousness. The remaining 3 were conscious but traumatized, staring at me with expressions that mixed horror and accusation. I had killed my own sons. Not in battle, not sacrificing them for some noble purpose, but through my own hubris, through my certainty that I knew better than the restrictions placed on me, through my belief that the rules did not apply when I was the one breaking them. My own body had sustained damage from channeling that much power. My form, usually perfect and controlled, flickered. Parts of me phased in and out of material reality for hours before I could stabilize. I felt fragments of myself scattered across multiple dimensions, and gathering them back together required concentration I could barely maintain. I tried to reach my father again. Tried to explain that I had only meant to warn him, that the breach had been unintentional, that I had been trying to save him from Horus's betrayal. But there was nothing, no response, no acknowledgement. The connection I had always felt with him, subtle but constant since my creation, was gone. Severed, the immediate aftermath was silence. Not physical silence. Prospero continued as it always had. The library still hummed with the quiet murmur of students researching. The training halls still echoed with the sounds of combat practice. The city of Tizca still bustled with the daily activities of remembrancers and scholars who had come from across the galaxy to study here. But psychic silence. The connection I had always felt with my father, subtle but constant since my creation, was gone. Severed. Whether by his will or as a consequence of what I had done, I could not tell, but the result was the same. I had been cut off completely from the being who had created me and given me purpose. I tried to reach out to him, tried to explain that I had only meant to warn him, that the breach had been unintentional, that I had been trying to save him from Horus's betrayal. Every day I attempted contact. Every day I was met with nothing, not even rejection. Just emptiness where there had always been presence. It was like losing a sense. Imagine being able to see your entire life and then suddenly going blind. That was what this felt like. I had always known where my father was, what mood he was in, whether he was pleased or concerned with my work. That awareness had been as natural as breathing, and now it was simply gone. My body slowly recovered from the trauma of channeling so much power. The dimensional dispersal ended after 3 days of intensive meditation. The burns from the psychic energy faded. The tremors in my hands stopped. Physically, I appeared normal again, but I felt hollow, as if something essential had been removed and the empty space remained. Of my 9 anchors, 6 were dead. Their minds had been burned out by the energies they had tried to help me contain. Ahriman worked desperately to save the 3 who had survived. He used every technique we knew, every medical and psychic intervention available. But I knew the prognosis even before he confirmed it. 2 would remain comatose indefinitely, their minds too damaged to ever fully return to consciousness. The 3rd recovered physically but was never quite the same. He would serve adequately, but the brilliance that had made him valuable was diminished. I had killed my own sons, or damaged them beyond recovery. not through enemy action, not in service of some noble goal, but through my own hubris, through my certainty that I knew better than everyone else, through my belief that the restrictions placed on me were obstacles rather than safeguards. The first external communication came 3 days later, not from Terra, but from the Space Wolves. Lyman Russ, my brother who had always despised my studies, who had argued most forcefully at Nicaea for the prohibition of sorcery. His message was brief and clear. Magnus the Red, you are called to account for crimes against the Imperium. The Emperor has passed judgment. The sentence is censure. I am coming to Prospero to ensure compliance. Censure. The word meant nothing specific in Imperial law. It could mean anything from a formal reprimand to complete annihilation, but given that Russ was being sent to deliver it, and given the magnitude of what I had done, I suspected it would be severe. I called my captains together, the leadership of the 1,000 Sons, the warriors who had served me longest and most loyally. Ahriman, still exhausted from his efforts to save the surviving anchors. Phocis Takar, whose contempt for the Nicaea edict had always been barely concealed. Uthiza, the most disciplined of my commanders, a warrior who believed absolutely in hierarchy and order. Phael Toron, master of the Pyre cult, who commanded flame with precision that bordered on artistry. And several others, each commanding significant portions of my legion. They gathered in my audience chamber, a space designed for tactical planning and strategic discussion. The walls were covered with star charts showing our campaigns across the galaxy. Memorabilia from centuries of service lined the shelves. Awards and commendations given by the Emperor himself for exceptional service. All reminders of what we had been before I destroyed everything. The Emperor is sending Russ to censure us. I informed them. The nature of the censure is unclear, but it will not be gentle. Phocis Takar's fists clenched. His psychic presence radiated fury barely controlled. Let them come. We have done nothing wrong. You tried to warn the Emperor of betrayal. Whatever happened during that warning was unintentional. We should not be punished for your loyalty. I appreciated his loyalty, but he was wrong about one thing. We had done something wrong. I had violated explicit orders, caused catastrophic damage to the Emperor's greatest work, and killed 6 of my own sons in the process. The fact that my intentions had been good was irrelevant. The consequences were what mattered. The damage was real and could not be excused by good intentions. We will not resist, I declared. Whatever punishment the Emperor decrees, we will accept. We are loyal. We remain loyal, even if that loyalty is no longer believed or wanted. Several of my captains protested immediately. Ahriman in particular argued that defending ourselves was not the same as rebellion, that Russ had always sought excuse to attack us, and we should not simply allow it. That accepting undeserved punishment would set a dangerous precedent, encouraging future persecution of psykers throughout the Imperium. Phocis Takar was more direct. My lord, if we do not defend ourselves, Russ will slaughter us. You know his hatred for our gifts. You know he has wanted excuse to destroy the 1,000 Sons since Nicaea. If we simply stand aside, we will be annihilated. Then we will be annihilated, I replied. My tone brooking no argument, I gave the order. I caused the catastrophe. I will bear the consequences. And if that means the destruction of this legion, so be it. We will not raise weapons against other space marines. We will not compound my error with actual treason. The chamber filled with protests, but I was firm. I activated the Vox system and transmitted orders to all 1,000 Sons throughout the system. No defensive measures were to be taken. The orbital defense platforms would remain inactive. Ground forces would stay in their barracks. When Russ arrived, we would accept whatever judgment he brought. I was still trying to reach my father psychically. Every day I attempted contact. Every day I projected my thoughts toward Terra, hoping for any response, any indication that he understood my intentions, that he knew I had been trying to help, that despite everything, despite the disaster I had caused, I remained his loyal son. but there was only silence. The vast psychic presence that was the Emperor, which I should have been able to detect across any distance, was simply not there. Either he was shielding himself from me specifically, or the damage I had caused to the webway had required him to devote his full attention to containment. Either way, I could not reach him, could not explain, could not apologize or seek forgiveness. The silence was worse than any punishment. To have spent over a century in periodic contact with the greatest mind in existence and then to be suddenly cut off was a psychic wound that did not heal. I found myself standing in my chambers, reaching out habitually, only to remember that there was nothing there. No response, no acknowledgement, just emptiness. I threw myself into study, trying to understand exactly what I had done. I reviewed every moment of the ritual, analyzed every decision, tried to identify the precise point where I had lost control. The exercise was meant to be academic, a way to learn from my mistakes, but it was actually punishment, forcing myself to confront my failures in excruciating detail. The power I had drawn had come from a region of the warp I had not fully understood. I had believed I was simply accessing ambient energy. But I had been wrong. That energy had been deliberately positioned, offered, like a hunter leaving bait for an animal. I had taken it without recognizing it as such, and in doing so had opened myself to manipulation on a scale I had not believed possible. The entities I had spent decades studying had been studying me in return. They had analyzed my patterns of thought, identified my weaknesses, understood that I would respond to a crisis involving Horus by attempting to warn my father, had known that I would use forbidden techniques if I believed the stakes were high enough. They had not forced me to do anything. They had simply created conditions where I would make predictable choices, and those choices had served their purposes perfectly. I had thought myself immune to corruption because I understood the dangers. But understanding was not the same as immunity. I had been compromised not through ignorance, but through pride. Through certainty that my knowledge made me special, that the warnings that applied to others did not apply to me, that I could navigate dangers that would destroy lesser beings because I was Magnus the Red, master of the warp, most powerful psyker in the Imperium after the Emperor himself. And that pride had been exactly what they needed to manipulate me. Russ arrived in orbit around Prospero 47 days after his initial message. His fleet emerged from the warp in a formation that spoke of hostile intent. 6 full great companies of space wolves, accompanied by elements of the Custodian Guard and Sisters of Silence. The Custodians were the Emperor's personal guardians, warriors who never left Terra except on his direct orders. Their presence meant this was not simply Russ acting independently. This was the Emperor's explicit will being enforced. The Sisters of Silence were worse. An entire detachment of them, enough to create a null field that would suppress psychic ability across a wide area. They existed to hunt psykers and witches. Their very presence was an insult to everything the Thousand Suns represented. And the fact that they had been brought here made the Emperor's position absolutely clear. He viewed us as the very thing the Sisters were created to eliminate. I ordered no defensive measures. The orbital defense platforms that ringed Prospero were some of the most sophisticated in the Imperium. Capable of targeting and destroying capital ships at extreme range, they remained inactive. The ground forces stayed in their barracks, watching through viewports as the Space Wolves' fleet took up attack positions. I forbade any response. We would accept our punishment. We would prove our loyalty through compliance. But Russ did not demand surrender. He did not hail me or offer any chance for negotiation. He did not request that I present myself for judgment. He simply began bombardment. The first lance strikes hit the outer districts of Tizca, our capital city. Library that had stood for centuries, containing texts gathered from 1,000 worlds, vaporized in seconds. Residential sectors where thousands of remembrancers and scholars lived were reduced to molten glass. This was not censure. This was extermination. This was the deliberate destruction of everything we had built. I still ordered no response. Perhaps I was being tested. Perhaps the Emperor wanted to see if I would raise my hand against his executioners. I would not fail that test. I would endure whatever punishment was decreed, no matter how excessive it seemed. The bombardment continued for 6 hours. Methodical, systematic. Russ's forces targeting specific structures with precision that spoke of detailed intelligence preparation. They knew where every library was located, where every archive stood. They were not simply destroying a city, they were erasing knowledge itself. By the time it stopped, a third of Tizca was destroyed. Thousands of civilians were dead. Entire libraries of irreplaceable knowledge had been burned away. Texts that had survived the age of strife, that contained information found nowhere else in the galaxy, reduced to ash and molten stone. And still I had ordered no defense, no retaliation. Then the drop pods came. Space wolves descending in the thousands, supported by custodians and silent sisters. They made planetfall in the devastated zones and began advancing toward the intact sections of the city. Toward the Pyramid of Photep itself, the greatest library in the Imperium, which somehow had escaped the bombardment. My captains begged me to allow them to defend themselves. Watching their home burn, watching civilians die, watching brothers from other companies being killed by the bombardment without being permitted to respond, was torture for warriors bred for combat. But I remained firm. This was the Emperor's judgment. We would accept it. We had to accept it. To resist would be to prove we were traitors. We had to show that despite everything, we remained loyal, until I saw what Russ's forces were doing to the civilians. The remembrancers and scholars who had come to Prospero seeking knowledge were being executed, not quickly, not mercifully. The space wolves were taking their time, turning the streets of Tizca into an abattoir. These were not combatants. They were artists, writers, historians, scientists. They had no weapons and offered no resistance. They were running, trying to flee the devastation, and the space wolves were hunting them down like animals. I watched through psychic perception as a space wolf caught a remembrancer, a woman who had come to Prospero to write a history of the Great Crusade. She tried to explain that she was not a warrior, that she meant no harm. He killed her anyway, slowly, and then laughed about it with his pack, brothers. I watched as a group of scholars barricaded themselves in what remained of a minor library, trying to save what texts they could. Space wolves broke through the barricades and executed them among the burning books. Not because they posed any threat, but because they were there, because they had chosen to come to Prospero to learn. These were not combatants, they were innocents, and they were being slaughtered for the crime of seeking knowledge. I felt something break inside me. Not my loyalty to the Emperor. That remained intact. I still believed he was humanity's greatest hope. Still believed the Imperium was necessary for human survival, but my willingness to accept that this brutality was his will, that I could not sustain. The Emperor, I knew, the being who had created me and my brothers, would never order this, would never sanction the murder of innocents and the burning of libraries. This was something else. This was Russ unleashed. Russ given permission to do what he had always wanted to do. To destroy the Legion he had always hated. To prove his righteousness through massacre. I reached out to my brother, mind to mind, hoping that despite everything he would show some fragment of mercy. Layman, please. These are innocents, scholars and artists. They pose no threat to the Imperium. Let them evacuate. Judge me, judge my Legion, but spare those who came here only to learn. His response was immediate and filled with contempt. His psychic presence was crude but powerful, like a blunt instrument compared to my precision tools. You broke the Emperor's law, Magnus. You dabbled in sorcery and brought ruin. Now you will pay the price. Your world will burn. Your Legion will die, and you will watch every moment of it before I drag you to terror in chains. There was no reasoning with him, no appeal to mercy or proportionality. He was not here to censure. He was here to destroy, and he was doing so with savage enthusiasm that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with his personal hatred of psychers. I gave the order I had sworn I would never give. The order I had believed would make me a traitor. Defend yourselves. Defend Prospero. We will not die without fighting back. My sons erupted from their positions. Finally permitted to act, they struck with all the fury of warriors who had watched their home burn. Psychic powers that had been restrained were unleashed. Ancient weapons that had remained in their vaults, forbidden by the Nicaea edict but maintained nonetheless, were brought to bear. The 1,000 Suns met the Space Wolves in the ruins of Tisca, and the streets ran red with the blood of Space Marines. I took to the battlefield myself. My form expanded to its full combat size, towering over even my own sons. I wielded sorcery without restraint now, not to attack, but to defend. Shields of telekinetic force protected my sons from bolter fire. Waves of force pushed back advancing wolves without killing them. I was trying to save what remained of my legion while minimizing casualties among my attackers. Because despite everything, despite Russ's brutality and his refusal to show mercy, I still believed there was a way out of this, a way to survive with some fragment of my legion intact. We could evacuate, flee to the outer reaches of the galaxy, continue our studies in exile. Perhaps one day the Emperor would understand what had actually happened and call us home. Perhaps this would pass like a storm, leaving damage but not complete destruction. Then I felt the warp currents shift. Something massive was manifesting. The barriers between reality and the immaterium were thinning across all of Prospero, and I realized with horror what was happening. The amount of psychic energy being unleashed by the battle, combined with my own earlier breach of the palace wards, had weakened the veil separating reality from the warp. Demons were beginning to manifest, not summoned, not called, simply drawn to the violence and death like flies to a corpse. They emerged from the air itself, reality tearing open to allow them passage. Lesser warp entities at first, formless things of rage and hunger, then greater ones, taking shapes that hurt the mind to perceive directly, and they attacked both sides indiscriminately. I saw a pack of space wolves torn apart by materializing horrors, beings of living flame that could not be harmed by bolter fire. Saw my own sons dragged screaming into pockets of unreality that opened beneath their feet. The battle had become something worse than I could have imagined. Prospero itself was being consumed by the warp. Reality was fracturing under the weight of so much psychic violence. This was what the Emperor had feared, what the Nicaea edict had been designed to prevent. A psychic war that would thin the barriers of reality and allow the warp to bleed through. And I had brought it about through my pride and my certainty that I knew better. First, by breaching the palace wards, weakening reality across the entire system. And now, by allowing my legion to use their full powers in battle, further destabilizing the barrier. The battle for Prospero lasted 3 days. 3 days of constant warfare as my legion fought desperately to protect what remained of our home, while I struggled to contain the warp breaches that my own actions had created. By the end, there was almost nothing left to fight for. The Pyramid of Photep, my greatest achievement, was rubble. The libraries that had contained century accumulated knowledge were ash. The residential districts where scholars from across the Imperium had come to study were graves. 40,000 sons had been reduced to fewer than 10,000 survivors, many of them wounded. And the civilian population of Prospero, the remembrancers and scholars and artists who had come here seeking enlightenment, were dead, almost to a person. I found Russ standing amid the ruins of what had been the central plaza of Tisca. His armor was gore-spattered, painted red with the blood of my sons and the ichor of demons. His face showed satisfaction rather than regret. He had done what he came to do. He had destroyed the 1,000 suns and shown the galaxy what happened to those who violated the Emperor's edicts. "Is this what you wanted?" I asked him, too exhausted for anger, my voice barely above a whisper. "To burn library and kill scholars? To prove your righteousness through massacre?" He turned to face me, and I saw something in his eyes I had not expected. Doubt. Brief, quickly suppressed, but present. For just a moment, looking at the devastation he had wrought, he questioned whether he had gone too far, whether the Emperor had truly intended this level of destruction. Then his features hardened again, and the doubt was buried beneath certainty. "I did what the Emperor commanded," he replied, his voice rough from bellowing orders across 3 days of combat. "You brought this on yourself through your arrogance. You broke his law. You damaged his greatest work. You unleashed demons on your own world. This is the consequence of your choices." The Emperor commanded censure. I countered. Not annihilation, not the murder of innocents, not the burning of irreplaceable knowledge. You chose to interpret his order as license for atrocity. You could have taken me into custody, could have confiscated our libraries and brought them to Terra, could have evacuated the civilians before you began bombardment. But you chose destruction. That choice was yours, not his. His hand went to his weapon, but he did not draw it. We were both too damaged to continue fighting. The battle was over. He had won by every measure that mattered. My legion was broken. My world was destroyed. My reputation was ruined beyond redemption. "Where will you run?" he asked. "There is nowhere in the galaxy. The Emperor's justice will not find you." He was right about that. Terra was barred to me forever. My brother Primarchs would consider me traitor or heretic. The human worlds of the Imperium would revile my name as the one who had betrayed the Emperor's trust. I had thought I was saving my father. Instead, I had destroyed everything I had been created to protect. Russ's forces began their withdrawal. They took what spoils they deemed worth carrying. Some texts that had survived the burning, equipment from our workshops, gene seed from fallen 1,000 suns. They loaded their ships methodically, taking 3 full days to complete the evacuation. And during that entire time, I simply watched, too exhausted and broken to do anything else. As the last Space Wolves vessels departed orbit, I gathered my surviving sons, fewer than 10,000 from a legion that had once numbered 40,000. They looked to me for guidance, for explanation, for some way to make sense of what had happened, for orders that would tell them what came next. I had none. I had broken the Emperor's law, trying to save him from betrayal. I had been punished for that violation by a brother who had always hated me. And now I stood in the ashes of my home with no path forward except the ones I had spent my entire existence trying to avoid. Ahriman approached me as the last Space Wolves vessels disappeared beyond orbital range. His armor was damaged, his face showing exhaustion that went beyond the physical. "My lord, what are your orders? Where do we go from here?" I looked at him. My most trusted son, a scholar as dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge as I had been. He deserved better than what I was about to tell him. They all deserved better than what I had brought upon them through my arrogance. "We cannot return to the Imperium," I said, the words heavy as stone. "My father will not forgive what I did to his Webway project. Russ will hunt us to the edge of the galaxy if given the chance. The Inquisition will mark us as traitors and heretics. We have only one option left." I did not say the words. I did not need to. Ahriman understood what I meant. We would have to seek shelter from the very powers I had spent my life studying. The entities in the warp who had been watching me, manipulating me, waiting for this exact moment. The Chaos Gods who had used my attempt to save my father as a means to bring about my damnation. They would welcome us. Not because they loved us, but because we were useful, because a legion of psychically gifted space marines with nowhere else to turn was exactly the tool they needed. And because I had already, through my actions, proven that I could be manipulated into serving their purposes while believing I served my own. We stood in silence for a long time, looking at the ruins of everything we had built. The destroyed libraries, the shattered towers, the graves of thousands who had trusted me to protect them. All of it was my responsibility. All of it was the consequence of my certainty that I knew better than everyone else. We did not immediately flee to the Eye of Terror. I was not yet so broken that I would embrace damnation without exhausting every alternative. Instead, we scattered. Small groups of 1,000 suns went to different corners of the galaxy, seeking places where we might hide and regroup, seeking some path that did not end in either annihilation or corruption. I took a handful of my closest advisors and went to a dead world at the edge of the halo stars, a place so remote that even the Imperium's records did not properly catalog it. We established a temporary base in the ruins of some Xenos civilization that had died out millennia before humanity reached the stars. The structures were unlike anything built by human hands. Geometric patterns that existed in more than 3 dimensions. Materials that remained intact despite obvious age. Technologies we could not begin to understand. We made our shelter in what might have been a temple or observatory. A structure that remained weatherproof and defensible despite its age. And there, in the silence of a tomb world, I tried to understand what I had become. The connection to my father remained severed. I reached out daily, hourly sometimes, hoping for any response. Any indication that he might still consider me his son, that despite everything, despite the catastrophic damage I had caused, he understood my intentions had been pure. But there was nothing. He had cut me off completely. Whether because he believed I had betrayed him or because he could not risk any further contact given what I had done, I did not know. What I did know was that the entities in the warp were watching me. I could feel their attention constantly now. 4 distinct presences, each vast and patient and utterly inhuman. They were not forcing anything. Not demanding I pledge myself or make any bargain. They were simply waiting, knowing that desperation and isolation would eventually drive me to them. Ahriman studied alongside me in those months. We analyzed everything that had happened, tried to identify the precise moments where I could have chosen differently, where another decision might have led to a different outcome. The exercise was pointless from a practical standpoint. We could not change the past. But it was necessary for my own understanding. I needed to know exactly how I had failed. The first error had been assuming that my knowledge made me immune to manipulation. I had studied the Chaos Gods extensively. I knew their methods, their strategies, their goals. I believed that understanding them meant I could not be used by them. But knowledge without wisdom is just data. Facts without context. I had known what they were without understanding what they were capable of doing to someone who believed himself superior to their influence. The second error had been prioritizing speed over verification. When I had seen Horus being corrupted, I had acted immediately. I had not taken time to confirm the observation through multiple sources, had not considered whether what I was seeing might itself be a manipulation designed to trigger exactly the response I had given. I had seen a crisis and responded with the first tool available, without asking whether that crisis might be manufactured specifically to make me reach for that tool. The third error had been believing that my intentions would protect me from consequences. I had meant well. I had been trying to save my father, trying to prevent a catastrophe. But the road to damnation was paved with good intentions, and my good intentions had resulted in catastrophic damage regardless of what I had meant to accomplish. During one of our study sessions, sitting in what might have been the central chamber of the ancient Xenos structure, Ahriman voiced the question I had been avoiding. My lord, Horus, was he actually corrupted? Did you see something real, or did the Chaos Gods simply make you think you saw corruption to provoke you into breaching the palace wards? I had been asking myself the same question for months. The answer, I finally admitted, was that I did not know. I had seen something. Whether it was truth, illusion, or some mixture of both was now impossible to determine. But it did not matter. My response had been the same regardless. I had violated the Emperor's most fundamental restriction because I believed I was saving him. Whether the threat was real or manufactured, my actions had destroyed his greatest work. We received word eventually. Fragmentary reports carried by wandering traders and rogue psychers who had no idea who we were. The galaxy was burning. Horus had indeed turned traitor, bringing half the legions with him. The War Master I had tried to warn my father about had declared war on the Imperium itself. The very betrayal I had foreseen was unfolding exactly as I had predicted. But my warning had never been delivered, or rather, it had been delivered in a form so catastrophic that my father had been unable to act on it. By the time he finished dealing with the breach I had created in his webway, Horus's corruption was already complete. The trap had already been sprung. I had been right about the threat, I had been right about Horus, but I had been so spectacularly wrong about how to address it that being right about the problem was meaningless, worse than meaningless, because my attempt to warn had consumed resources that might have been used to actually stop the betrayal, had distracted my father at the critical moment, had perhaps even contributed to making the heresy possible by weakening the Emperor's strategic position. The bitter irony was not lost on me. If I had simply done nothing, if I had trusted my father to handle the situation or used conventional means to investigate further, the outcome might have been different. The Webway project would still be intact, giving the Emperor unprecedented strategic mobility. My legion would still be loyal, providing psychic support to Imperial forces. I would still be my father's son, available to help him when he needed it most. I am Magnus the Red. I tried to save my father and destroyed his greatest work. I tried to warn him of betrayal and was cast out as a traitor myself. I tried to serve the Imperium and became its enemy. Every choice I made with good intentions led to catastrophic consequences. The question that haunts me is not whether I should have acted differently. That much is obvious. The question is whether I could have. Whether my nature, shaped by my creation and my upbringing and the powers I was born with, made this outcome inevitable. I was designed to seek knowledge, trained to trust my own understanding, built to believe that no problem was beyond my ability to solve. Perhaps the flaw was not in my actions, but in what I was. But I cannot accept that entirely, because at every step, I had a choice. When I saw Horus being corrupted, I could have chosen to investigate further before acting, could have taken time to verify through multiple sources, could have used conventional means to warn my father rather than breaking his most fundamental law. When I began gathering power for the ritual, I could have stopped when I felt it becoming uncontrollable, could have recognized that I was drawing from sources I did not fully understand, could have accepted that some warnings could not be delivered, and that attempting to deliver them might cause more harm than remaining silent. When Russ came to Prospero, I could have evacuated immediately rather than waiting to accept punishment. Could have scattered my legion before the bombardment began, could have saved thousands of innocents who died because I believed that accepting judgment would prove my loyalty. I made choices. They were bad choices, but they were mine. I cannot claim inevitability or fate or the machinations of chaos gods, though all of those played their parts. I was the one who decided. I was the one who acted. The consequences are mine to bear. What happens when you try to save someone by breaking every rule meant to protect them? You prove why those rules existed. You demonstrate that good intentions are not enough. You become an example of hubris punished, of knowledge without wisdom leading to ruin. I sit in my tower on the planet of sorcerers, master of a corrupted legion in a realm of nightmare. I possess more power than ever before, more knowledge, more capability, can perceive realities that most beings cannot conceive, can manipulate forces that reshape existence itself, and it is all worthless. Because I lost the only thing that mattered, my father's trust, my place in his imperium, my purpose. The chaos gods whisper that I should be grateful, that they have given me immortality and power. That I am free from the restrictions of the Imperium. That I can pursue knowledge without limit, study the warp without prohibition, become something greater than what the Emperor intended me to be. But I know what I am. I am a warning, an example of what happens when a son believes he knows better than his father, when a scholar believes his knowledge makes him wise. When someone with the power to break the universe believes they have the wisdom to do so safely. If there are others like me, others who believe their intelligence or power or special nature makes them immune to consequences, I have this to say. You are not special. The rules exist for everyone, especially for those who believe they are exceptions. The moment you think you know better than every restriction placed on you is the moment you begin walking the path I walked. I tried to save my father. I destroyed everything instead. That is what happens when you confuse knowledge with wisdom, power with judgment, and certainty with truth. That is what happens when you believe the rules do not apply to you. That is what happens when Magnus the Red tries to save his father. The galaxy is vast and uncaring. It grinds forward regardless of individual intentions or regrets. My legion endures in the eye, slowly becoming something else entirely. The Imperium struggles on without the Emperor's direct guidance, having become the very thing he tried to prevent, a theocracy built on superstition and fear.